The farmer returned to his abandoned ranch after 30 years. Everyone was sure there was nothing left but ruins and dust. But what he found among the wreckage, animals that had survived all those years without an owner, shocked him and changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The road stretched out in front of him, cracked and broken in places, overgrown with weeds that had pushed their way through the gravel during 30 long years of neglect. Jonathan Rowland sat stiffly on the driver's seat of the battered old truck, the steering wheel vibrating beneath his hands as though reminding him with each mile that this journey could not be undone. He had driven this road before, as a boy of barely 15, when his father urged the family to leave everything behind after the storm. But then the road had felt alive, a part of his childhood, a vein leading straight into the beating heart of the only home he had known. Now it was silent, hollow, like an echo of something that had once mattered. The town had laughed when he said he was going back. Old friends, men who had grown up alongside him, had smirked and shaken their heads. "Why waste your money?" and they asked. "That place is nothing but rot and shadows. Nothing stands after 30 years on the prairie without a roof over it." Some had told him flat out that he was crazy. They thought he was chasing ghosts, and perhaps he was. But Jonathan carried something inside that none of them could see, a restlessness that had never left him, a sense that part of himself had been buried beneath the rubble of that house the night the hurricane winds tore it apart. When the storm had struck, it had been merciless. He remembered the sound most of all, the roar of the wind, a freight train bearing down on the wooden beams, the splintering crack of timber as the roof peeled away like a sheet of paper. His mother had clutched him so tightly his ribs ached for days afterward, while his father shouted orders above the chaos. Then the rain came in torrents, tearing through fields and flooding the barn until the livestock scattered or drowned. By dawn, there was nothing left that resembled the home they had built with their own hands. His father made the choice no farmer wants to make. They abandoned the land, left behind the wreckage, and started anew in the city. But the city had never been home. Jonathan tried. He worked, he earned, he aged. His parents passed one after another, carrying with them the quiet sorrow of people who had been uprooted and never found soil that welcomed them again. Jonathan buried them with dutiful grief, yet in the silence of his nights he heard the land calling him, whispering across the decades. He knew that sooner or later he would go back, not because it was practical, not because it made sense, but because a part of him had never truly left. So now, with nothing much tying him to the city, he returned. The truck rattled as it crested the last hill, and in the distance he saw the faint outline of the ranch house, or what was left of it. He slowed, his hands tightening on the wheel. The sight struck him with a force he had not expected. The house stood like a skeleton, its windows hollow, its roof caved in. The barn beside it leaned precariously, a shadow of what it had once been. The corral fencing had collapsed in several places, long boards bleached gray and brittle by the sun. The fields where wheat once shimmered in the breeze were covered in wild grass and thorn. He pulled the truck to a stop at the edge of the yard and sat motionless. 30 years had passed, yet it felt as if time itself had held its breath here. Nothing new had risen. No hand had tried to claim the land. It was as though the storm had not only destroyed the buildings, but cast a spell of silence over the place. Jonathan stepped down from the truck and felt the crunch of dry earth beneath his boots. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, tinged with the sweetness of wildflowers that had invaded the yard. The porch sagged as he mounted the steps, the boards groaning under his weight. He placed his hand on the doorframe, the wood rough and splintered beneath his palm. He half expected to hear his mother's voice calling him in for supper, or his father's stern bark reminding him to mend a fence before the sun went down. Instead, there was only silence, thick and oppressive. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the collapsed structures, the ruined roof lines, the scattered remnants of his childhood. His chest tightened. This was supposed to be homecoming, but it felt like trespassing among ghosts. Yet as he stood there, a curious sensation crept over him. The house was broken, yes. The barn was barely standing. The fields were choked. But the land itself, the soil beneath his feet, the air pressing against his skin, was the same. It was alive, waiting. It carried the memory of what once was and the possibility of what could be again. And as that thought took root, he felt something stir inside him, an echo of the boy who once dreamed of working this land, who once believed that sweat and patience could turn wilderness into plenty. Jonathan stepped away from the porch and walked toward the barn. The doors hung crooked, one torn from its hinges, the other leaning heavily against the frame. He pushed, and the door creaked but gave way, revealing darkness within. The smell struck him first, mold, dust, but also something sharper, unmistakable, the scent of life. He froze. For a long moment, he thought he imagined it, but then he heard it, the faint cluck of a hen, the shuffle of hooves against dirt. His brow furrowed. The barn was not empty. He edged inside, eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through holes in the roof. At first he saw only shadows, piles of broken boards and tangled rope. Then movement caught his eye. A hen scurried across the floor, feathers ruffled, disappearing into a dark corner. His heart skipped. He turned and saw more. A handful of chickens perched on the rafters, feathers dusty but eyes alert. In a makeshift pen formed by fallen beams, 2 pigs rooted in the earth, snorting as if they had always belonged here. He took a step back, astonishment pressing through his exhaustion. The farm was not entirely dead. Somehow life had found a way to cling to the ruins. His gaze lifted, and there, in the far corner of the corral beyond the barn, stood a horse. The animal was gaunt, its coat dulled by neglect, but it stood with a dignity that made his throat tighten. The horse lifted its head, ears pricked, and stared at him, with eyes that seemed to recognize something familiar. Jonathan swallowed hard, emotions churning. He had come expecting silence and emptiness. Instead, he found a remnant of the life his family had lost. Animals abandoned, forgotten, yet surviving. For a moment he wondered who had left them here, who had allowed them to linger through the years. But the more he looked, the more he realized they had become part of the land itself. Creatures drawn here, as if by some unspoken promise of shelter. He stood in the doorway of the barn, staring at the animals that had made their kingdom among the ruins, and felt the weight of his decision settle upon him. The people in town thought he was a fool. They would never understand what he saw now. This was not rot. This was not waste. This was life asking to be protected. 30 years ago, the storm had driven him away. Today, the land had called him back. And as the sun dipped low, painting the broken ranch in hues of gold and crimson, Jonathan Rowland knew he had found his purpose. He turned back toward the house, the sagging roof outlined against the setting sun. And though sorrow still clung to him, it was threaded now with determination. The ruins were not the end of the story. They were only the beginning. Jonathan hardly slept that first night back on the land. He lay in what was left of the farmhouse, a place that had once been the center of his childhood, but now resembled little more than a shell. The roof above him had gaping holes that let the stars peer down like distant witnesses to his restless return. The wind whistled through the broken windows, and the floor creaked as though remembering every step that had ever been taken within these walls. Sleep eluded him, not only because of the cold drafts that moved over his blanket, but because of the sights and sounds he had discovered in the barn earlier that evening. He could still hear them in his mind, the cluck of hens, the snort of pigs, the watchful silence of the horse. They haunted him not as ghosts, but as living reminders that this land was not yet finished with him. At dawn, when the sky turned from black to gray, and finally to the soft blush of morning, he rose and stepped outside. The dew clung to the tall grass, soaking his boots as he made his way toward the barn again. His breath came out in white puffs against the cool air. He paused at the doorway, hand resting on the weathered wood. For a moment he wondered if the animals had been some strange trick of the twilight, an illusion born of his exhausted mind. But then the unmistakable sounds reached him again, grounded and real. He pushed the door open. Inside, the chickens stirred, some fluttering down from the rafters where they had roosted through the night. Their feathers were ragged, but they moved with surprising energy, scratching the dirt floor and pecking at unseen morsels. Jonathan knelt slowly, watching them, marveling at the fact that creatures so small and fragile had endured where buildings of wood and stone had collapsed. He spotted eggs in the corner, nestled against a pile of straw that must have been gathered over time. He reached for one, holding its fragile shell in his hand, and felt a strange surge of emotion. It was not just an egg. It was proof that life, however neglected, had refused to surrender. He turned toward the pen where the pigs rooted. They were leaner than they should have been, their ribs faintly visible beneath their rough hides, but their eyes held a glimmer of determination. One of them lifted its head, mud smeared across its snout, and grunted at him as if demanding to know who he was and what right he had to intrude on their stubborn survival. Jonathan smiled faintly, something he had not done in years. He crouched and reached out, palm open, letting the animal decide whether to approach. Slowly, cautiously, it did. Beyond the barn in the corral, the horse stood once more, as if it had waited all night for him to return. The creature was thinner than he remembered any of their horses being when he was a boy, but it held itself with undeniable pride. Its mane was tangled and burrs clung to its tail. But when it moved, even in that confined, ruined space, Jonathan could see the strength that had carried it through long years of neglect. The horse tossed its head when it saw him, a sharp, defiant gesture that filled him with unexpected respect. He walked slowly toward it, careful not to startle the animal, speaking in a low voice, though he did not know why. Perhaps it was the memory of his father teaching him how to handle horses with patience and calm. Perhaps it was the simple reverence he felt for this creature that had outlasted storms and solitude. The horse stamped once, then stilled, allowing him to approach close enough to place a tentative hand on its neck. The coat was rough, the skin beneath taut with bone, but it was warm and alive. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, letting the weight of that realization sink into him. And then, as if in answer to the question of how these animals had survived all this time, a pack of dogs appeared from the shadows. He heard them first, the patter of paws and the low growl that carried a warning. Turning, he saw 3 of them, ribs showing, coats dirty and unkempt, but their eyes burned bright with alertness. Behind them, darting between the beams of sunlight that cut through holes in the roof, a handful of cats slinked silently, their movements sleek and watchful. Jonathan did not move. He stood in the middle of the barn, surrounded now by a ragtag assembly of creatures, all of them orphans of circumstance, survivors who had made this broken place their sanctuary. For a moment he felt as though he had stepped into some ancient kingdom, not of men but of animals, a realm that had quietly taken root amid the ruins. They looked at him with suspicion, some with curiosity, some with open challenge. He realized then that they did not belong to him. They were not waiting for a master. They had been living on their own terms, bound together only by the need to endure. Yet somehow they had accepted him enough to reveal themselves, to show him their fragile domain. Jonathan spent the rest of the morning among them, moving slowly, speaking little, letting them accustom themselves to his presence. He cleaned a space in the barn, cleared away broken boards and debris, giving the animals more room to move. He searched for anything left behind that might help, a rusted water trough that could still hold liquid if patched, a length of rope that could be used to mend a pen, scraps of wood that could serve as temporary barriers. It was humble work, but with each action he felt a sense of belonging that had been missing from his life for decades. By midday, sweat clung to his brow, and his muscles ached, but the barn no longer felt like a tomb. It was alive, humming with movement, with feathers and hooves and paws. He stood at the doorway, leaning against the frame, and looked out at the ruined house. The contrast was striking. The house was silent, filled with memories and dust, a monument to what had been lost. The barn, though broken, held the pulse of survival. It was as if the land itself had chosen to keep its heart beating through these creatures until someone returned to care again. That evening, when Jonathan sat on the porch steps, eating the last of the bread he had brought with him, the sounds of the animals drifted across the yard. The cluck of hens settling for the night, the occasional grunt of the pigs, the steady breathing of the horse. All of it formed a chorus that wrapped around him like a blanket. He realized then that he could not leave. To walk away now would be to abandon not only the animals, but the fragile hope they represented. The people in town would laugh louder than ever if they saw him here. They would shake their heads at the sight of a grown man choosing to live among beasts in the wreckage of a once proud ranch. But Jonathan knew their laughter meant nothing. For the first time in 30 years, he felt rooted. These animals had made their kingdom out of ruin, and perhaps, if he was brave enough, he could become part of it. Night fell, and he returned to the farmhouse. But this time he did not feel the oppressive weight of silence. Beyond the broken walls, life stirred. Beyond the splintered beams, a kingdom breathed. As he lay down, listening to the faint sounds drifting from the barn, Jonathan Rowland understood that his journey had only begun. He had come back to ruins, but he had found a charge, a responsibility that bound him more tightly than any chain. Tomorrow he would rise and begin again. Not for himself alone, but for the kingdom of forgotten animals that had been waiting for him all along. The next morning, Jonathan woke with a sense of weight pressing on his chest, not only from the cold air seeping through the gaps in the farmhouse walls, but from the knowledge that he could not linger in a haze of memories and vague intentions. The discovery of the animals had changed everything. They had lived without him for years, clinging to life in ways he could barely imagine. But now that he had seen them, now that they had acknowledged his presence and tolerated his hand among them, there was no turning back. He had taken on an unspoken responsibility. They were his now, in spirit if not in law. And with that came obligations he had no choice but to face. The barn was not enough to keep them safe. He could see it as soon as the sun rose high enough to reveal the sagging roof and leaning beams in full daylight. The pigs rooted dangerously close to where a wall might collapse if a strong wind swept through. The horse shifted its weight uneasily, every step a reminder of how fragile the corral had become. Even the chickens fluttered nervously when gusts whistled through the barn's broken boards. These creatures had survived storms, hunger, and neglect, but they would not survive forever in this decaying shelter. Jonathan realized that the first step was not some grand restoration of the ranch, but something far simpler and more urgent. He had to keep them alive. He set about the work clumsily at first, searching among the ruins for anything he could use. The old water trough he had found the day before was cracked down one side, but with tar scraped from an abandoned barrel and a strip of metal he pried loose from the shed, he managed to patch it enough to hold water again. It was rough work, leaving his hands blistered and blackened, but when he poured the first bucketful from the half-cleared well and saw the animals press forward to drink, a fierce pride rose in him. It was a small victory, but on this land, small victories were seeds of hope. The well itself was another matter. It had been filled with debris, stones, and years of weeds that clung stubbornly to the edges. For hours, Jonathan strained with a shovel and rope, hauling out bucket after bucket of muck. Sweat drenched his back despite the chill in the air, and his muscles ached with a pain that reminded him of boyhood days when his father had demanded endless work from dawn to dusk. But unlike then, there was no stern voice driving him on, no family expectation weighing on his shoulders. This labor was his choice, freely made, and that made every bruise and scrape meaningful. As the days passed, he began to create a rhythm. At dawn, he checked the animals, gathering the eggs the chickens left for him and feeding scraps to the pigs. He spoke softly to the horse as he brushed tangles from its mane with the broken bristles of a long-forgotten comb. The dogs followed him more closely with each passing day, their suspicion gradually giving way to trust, while the cats slinked in and out like shadows, never far but never fully committed to his presence. Then he worked on the land itself, clearing brush, mending what fences he could, scavenging nails from broken planks to piece together makeshift repairs. It was backbreaking and often humiliating work. He was not the young man he once had been. His joints stiffened in the cold mornings, and his back protested every hour spent bent over. Yet each evening, when he sat outside and watched the animals settling down, he felt a kind of peace that no city wage, no tidy rented room had ever given him. News of his return spread quickly through the small town. Within a week, people began stopping by, some out of curiosity, others to sneer openly. Old neighbors leaned from their wagons, smirking at the sight of Jonathan hammering bent nails into rotted boards. "Building castles out of ashes, Rowland?" one man shouted before riding on. Children dared one another to creep onto the property, and then ran away shrieking with laughter at the sight of the half-collapsed barn. The town saw only failure where he saw a fragile beginning. Their words stung, though he told himself otherwise. In the quiet of the farmhouse at night, he could still hear their jeers echoing. Doubt grew like weeds in his mind. Was he truly rebuilding something, or was he merely clinging to ruins no sane man would touch? He thought of selling the land again, taking what little money he could and returning to the city. It would be easier, certainly. But then morning came, and the animals greeted him. The pigs nudged his legs, the chickens scattered around his feet, and the horse lifted its head as though acknowledging his return. Those moments banished his hesitation. Leaving would not be an escape, it would be a betrayal. One evening, exhausted from hours of hauling beams to brace the barn's walls, Jonathan sat by the fire pit he had dug near the farmhouse steps. Flames licked upward, sending sparks into the darkening sky. His body ached, his hands were raw, and the fire cast shadows across the broken house behind him. Yet he felt something stirring deep within, something he had not allowed himself in many years, a sense of purpose. It was fragile, easily crushed by failure or ridicule, but it was there nonetheless. The nights were the hardest. Alone in the farmhouse, the silence pressed in from every corner. The wind groaned through the broken walls, carrying with it whispers of the past. Sometimes he thought he could hear his mother's gentle hum as she worked in the kitchen, or the heavy tread of his father's boots crossing the floor. At times the memories comforted him, at others they left him hollow. He realized that he was not just fighting to rebuild the farm for the animals, he was fighting against the weight of loss that had defined his life since the night of the storm. Still, each morning he rose, and each morning the work continued. He planted stakes in the ground, marking where new fences would someday stand. He began gathering stones from the field, setting them in piles as a foundation for repairs. Every task was small, almost laughable in its insignificance when viewed against the enormity of 30 years of ruin, yet together they formed the outline of a vision he dared not voice aloud. The townspeople continued to mock him, but a few began to watch with quieter eyes. They saw the smoke rising steadily from his fire, the animals that grew healthier under his care, the faint changes in the land that suggested something more than stubborn pride. But even if none of them ever changed their minds, Jonathan knew he would continue. Because when he stood in the barn at night and listened to the steady breathing of the creatures around him, he felt part of something larger than his own grief. He had returned to ruins, yes. He had chosen a path lined with backbreaking work and ridicule. But in the rhythm of feeding, repairing, and caring, he felt the faint stirrings of a new life, one that demanded everything of him but promised something priceless in return. The road ahead was long, the trials endless, but the first steps had been taken, and in that small but vital beginning, Jonathan Rowland found hope. The weeks that followed turned into months, and Jonathan found himself caught in a cycle that felt both relentless and strangely grounding. Each day began with the sounds of the animals calling for him, a chorus that no longer startled him in the dawn, but instead pulled him to his feet before the sun had fully risen. There was no time to hesitate, no luxury for idleness. The chickens scattered around him in eager bursts of wings as he fed them grain he had managed to barter from a farmer in the next town. The pigs pressed against the worn boards of their pen, snorting with an energy that startled him with its persistence. The horse, still gaunt but stronger now than when he had first touched its neck, greeted him with a toss of the head that seemed to say it had accepted him at last. The dogs shadowed his every step, and even the cats, those silent watchers, began to curl on the broken porch at night, their eyes glowing like coals in the darkness. But with life came new burdens. One of the pigs fell ill in the early weeks of spring. It lay on its side, shivering, refusing food, its breathing ragged. Jonathan sat by its pen for hours, trying remedies he half remembered from boyhood, cool rags against its body, herbs steeped in water that he coaxed between its jaws. He whispered words of encouragement, though he knew the animal could not understand them. The fight stretched on for days. At night, exhausted, he feared he would find it dead in the morning. Yet each dawn the pig still drew breath, and with persistence it began to rise again. When at last it stood and staggered back to feed, Jonathan felt a surge of relief so strong it left him trembling. He had not expected the survival of one sick animal to matter so deeply, but it was as though its victory had given him permission to believe in his own. Predators came too. One night he awoke to a clamor in the barn, the frantic flutter of wings and the shrill cries of his hens. Rushing into the dark with only a lantern and the old revolver he kept for safety, he found a fox darting between shadows. The creature's eyes glowed when the lantern caught them, and for a moment they stared at one another, two survivors clinging to instinct. Jonathan drove it off with shouts and shots into the dirt, but the losses were real. Several hens lay scattered, lifeless, their feathers strewn across the floor. He buried them behind the barn, the soil still cold from winter's grip, and though he knew it was the way of life on the land, the grief weighed heavily on him. Every creature here had come to symbolize not just survival, but trust in his presence. Each loss felt like a broken promise. The strain was not only in the barns and pens. Money dwindled fast. Jonathan had brought some savings with him, meager but enough to purchase tools and feed when he could, but repairs consumed more than he had. He hired himself out in town, taking odd jobs, hauling lumber, fixing fences, sometimes simply shoveling manure for other farmers who eyed him with suspicion, but paid in cash or grain. He bore their whispers, their pointed laughter, and kept his focus on the thought of returning each evening to the land that had once been his father's. At night, when the work was done and the animals settled, he often wandered into the broken farmhouse. He sat at the old kitchen table, now warped and cracked, and let the silence press against him. It was in those hours that the past came strongest. He remembered his mother humming softly while stirring stew, the scent of herbs filling the room. He remembered his father's steady voice giving him instructions on planting, his hand heavy on Jonathan's shoulder whenever he stumbled, but did not give up. The house no longer carried those voices, only echoes. Yet the echoes reminded him of who he was and why he had returned. One evening, while prying up warped boards near the back wall in search of timber he could reuse, his hands struck something unexpected. The wood lifted with more effort than usual, and beneath it he found a small cavity, a space his father had clearly built long ago. Inside lay an old wooden box, its lid cracked but still intact. Jonathan drew it out and carried it into the fading light. Inside he found objects that brought a sudden sting to his eyes. Family photographs, yellowed but clear, showing his parents standing in front of the very house now broken around him, his younger self with a grin and dirt on his face, his sister clutching a doll she had lost years before. Beneath the photos lay a small book, its leather cover cracked with age. It was his father's handwriting inside, each page carefully filled. He sat there reading until the stars came out, his lantern flickering weakly beside him. The words were simple, journal entries written during those last months before the storm. They spoke of struggle, of debts unpaid, of nights spent worrying about the future, but woven through them was a thread of determination, a faith in the land that refused to die. One passage struck him hardest. This farm will only live again when someone chooses it not for wealth, not for ease, but for the life it holds. The earth gives only to those who give everything back. Jonathan closed the book and held it to his chest. The words felt like a hand reaching across decades, steadying him. His father had known the farm might fall. He had known it might be lost. But he had also believed that one day someone would come back to breathe life into it again. Jonathan felt that mantle settle onto his shoulders, heavy yet strangely right. From that night forward, the doubts that gnawed at him did not vanish, but they no longer had the power to cripple him. He still woke to exhaustion, still fought against decay and ridicule, but he carried his father's words as armor. When another storm rolled in one evening, shaking the barn with thunder and tearing loose the tarps he had used for makeshift repairs, he did not crumble into despair as he once might have. Instead, he fought the wind, pulling ropes tight, hammering boards until his arms screamed with pain. He kept the animals safe through the night, and though he collapsed in the mud by morning, he rose again with grim resolve. The land was testing him. Each hardship was a reminder that survival here was not granted, but earned, wrested day by day from earth and sky. Yet with every small triumph, the pig that lived, the water that flowed from the cleared well, the horse that began to regain its strength, he felt his own heart mending. The farm was no longer simply a place of ruins and sorrow. It was becoming a crucible, burning away weakness and shaping him into something stronger. Still, shadows lingered. He sometimes heard voices in the wind, his own doubts speaking in the laughter of townsfolk, in the mocking tones of men who said he was wasting his life. At night he fought not only the silence of the broken house, but the memories of failure that had haunted him since the storm drove them away. Yet each morning, when the animals greeted him, their need was stronger than his fear. He fed them, tended them, and in their survival he saw his own reflected. Jonathan Rowland was no longer merely a man chasing ghosts. He was a man reclaiming not just a farm, but himself. The past had scarred him, the present battered him, but in that struggle he found a truth he could cling to. The land did not care for ridicule or despair. It asked only for devotion. And in giving that devotion, he found at last the beginning of peace. Spring stretched into summer, and Jonathan found himself moving through the days with a rhythm that had become as natural to him as breathing. What once felt like impossible labor, endless tasks pressing down on his shoulders with the weight of futility, had slowly transformed into routine. His body hardened with the work, his hands grew calloused until they seemed more like tools than flesh, and his back no longer protested every swing of the hammer or lift of a beam. He had grown into the demands of the land, and the land in return had begun to yield something back to him. The first signs were small, almost imperceptible, but they mattered more to him than gold. The hens, once ragged and skittish, grew healthier under his steady care. Their feathers smoothed, their eyes brightened, and each morning he found more eggs than the day before. He gathered them in a battered basket, marveling at their warm weight in his palms. And each one felt like a promise that his labor was not in vain. The pigs, too, flourished, rooting happily in the pens he had patched and reinforced, growing fatter by the week. When one of them gave birth to a litter of squealing piglets, Jonathan stood by in awe, as though he had been granted a glimpse of the earth's quiet miracle. The horse, which had once stood so gaunt and weary, now moved with strength in its step. Jonathan spent hours brushing its coat, tending to its hooves, and whispering to it as though the animal could understand. Over time, it had come to nudge him with its muzzle, following him around the corral with a loyalty that stirred something deep in his chest. He had begun to call it grace, not because life on the farm had grown easy, but because each day it survived, each day it grew stronger, felt like a gift of grace from the land itself. Even the dogs had changed. Once wary and half-wild, they became his constant companions, trotting at his heels wherever he went, alert to every sound in the fields. And though the cats still stalked silently in the shadows, their distrust remained tempered by the fact that they always returned at dusk, curling up in corners of the porch as if acknowledging that this place was theirs as much as his. Together they formed a patchwork family, bound not by choice but by necessity, and Jonathan cherished them all with a devotion that surprised him. Word of his progress reached the town, though the telling was always shaded by disbelief. Some continued to laugh, shaking their heads at the thought of a middle-aged man pouring sweat into ruins. Yet others had grown quiet in their judgment. They saw the eggs he brought to market, the piglets that thrived, the lean but sturdy horse that now carried him on short rides across the pasture. They could not ignore the signs of life returning to a place they had long considered dead. Some even offered words of guarded respect, though Jonathan had no illusions about their sincerity. He did not labor for their approval. His only measure of success was in the steady heartbeat of the farm itself. But the land, as always, tested him. Just when he began to believe that the worst of his struggle might be behind him, a storm unlike any he had yet faced gathered on the horizon. The sky darkened with a weight that made the air heavy, and the wind carried with it the sharp tang of coming violence. Jonathan had learned enough of weather to know when trouble was brewing, but nothing prepared him for the fury that would descend upon the farm that night. It began with distant rumbles, thunder rolling across the plains like the footsteps of giants. The animals grew restless, pacing and snorting, wings fluttering in anxious bursts. Jonathan hurried from one pen to another, reinforcing latches, tying ropes tighter, shoving makeshift boards against loose walls. The dogs barked furiously, their instincts crying out against the unseen threat. As darkness fell, the sky split open with jagged streaks of lightning, and the first drops of rain came like fists against the earth. Soon the storm was upon them in full. The wind howled through the broken farmhouse like a chorus of angry spirits, tearing at the roof, rattling every window. Sheets of rain battered the barn, finding every gap and weakness in the patched walls. Jonathan fought against it, hammering boards in the midst of the gale, his clothes soaked, his hair plastered to his face. He shouted to the animals, his voice lost in the roar, as he dragged Grace into the more sheltered corner of the corral and piled hay around the piglets to keep them from freezing in the sudden chill. The storm did not relent. For hours it raged, testing every nail he had driven, every beam he had set upright. Lightning flashed so bright it seared his eyes, and thunder cracked with such force it shook the ground beneath his boots. At one point, the wind tore a section of roof from the barn, sending it crashing into the mud with a sound like the breaking of bones. Jonathan threw his weight against the remaining walls, holding them as if his own body might keep them from collapse. His arms screamed with pain, his chest heaved with exhaustion, yet he would not let go. By dawn, the storm at last began to fade. The wind softened to a whisper, the rain slowed to a steady drizzle, and the thunder rolled away into the distance. Jonathan staggered out into the yard, his body trembling with fatigue. The land lay battered, strewn with debris, the farmhouse more broken than before. Yet when he turned toward the barn, he saw movement within. The hens fluttered down from their rafters, shaken but alive. The pigs huddled close, the piglets squealing but safe. Grace stood tall, shaking her mane as if to cast off the night's terror, her eyes bright and steady. Even the dogs wagged their tails at the sight of him, their bodies drenched but unbowed. Jonathan dropped to his knees in the mud, laughter and tears mingling on his face. He had feared that the storm would strip everything from him again, as it had 30 years before. But this time was different. This time he had not abandoned the farm. He had stood, fought, endured, and so had the animals. They had faced the storm together, and they had survived. The days that followed were filled with backbreaking work. He gathered fallen boards, hammered them back into place, and dragged debris into piles. The land bore scars from the storm, yet beneath those scars lay resilience. The soil drank the rain, the grass straightened under the sun, and the animals carried on as though determined to prove that no storm, however fierce, could end them. Jonathan felt a strength within himself that he had never known, a certainty that no ridicule or hardship could take away. When he walked into town a week later with a basket overflowing with eggs and a story of survival written in every line of his face, even those who had mocked him fell silent. They saw a man transformed, no longer chasing a ghost of the past, but standing firmly in the present, bound to the land with a devotion that could not be shaken. Some offered cautious respect, others still turned away, but none could deny what he had accomplished. Jonathan returned home that evening and sat on the porch, watching the sun sink low over the fields. The land glowed in the fading light, wet earth shimmering, the barn standing patched and proud despite its wounds. Around him the animals moved with contentment, their bodies whole, their spirits unbroken. He leaned back against the sagging post of the porch and let the peace wash over him. He had endured loss, ridicule, sickness, predators, and storm. And yet through it all, life had not only persisted but grown stronger. He knew now that he could no longer measure his days by what the town thought of him or by what wealth he might gain. His measure was here, in the steady rhythm of hooves and wings and breath, in the quiet miracle of survival. The farm had once been a place of ruin. Now it was alive again, and so was he. The storm that had battered the farm left behind not only broken boards and muddy fields, but also a deep and undeniable proof that Jonathan had become part of the land again. In the days that followed, he worked without pause, his muscles aching, his hands raw, yet his spirit stronger than ever. The animals had survived, and in their survival he saw reflected the triumph of his own heart. He no longer carried the weight of doubt that had haunted him when he first returned. The storm had tested him in the cruelest of ways, and he had endured. The farm was no longer just a ruin where he had chosen to linger. It was his home again, alive with purpose, scarred but unbroken. Seasons turned, and with each passing month, the land bore witness to his devotion. The fields that once lay tangled with weeds were cleared and planted. Grass grew thick and steady for grazing, and the once bare pasture rolled green beneath the summer sun. The barns, though still patched with boards of mismatched wood, stood sturdier with each repair, proof of the sweat that poured from his body each day. The farmhouse, too, began to change, little by little. New beams replaced rotting ones, windows were covered against the wind, and even the roof, though far from whole, offered shelter that no longer felt like a place of abandonment. The animals thrived in a way Jonathan had never dared hope when he first stumbled upon them. The pigs multiplied, filling the pens with life and sound, their snouts rooting eagerly in the soil. The hens grew so plentiful that he often carried basket upon basket of eggs into town, no longer for trade alone, but sometimes as gifts, his quiet way of bridging the distance between himself and neighbors who had once mocked him. Grace the horse grew sleek and powerful, her coat shining in the sun, her steps light and proud. She carried him now not in hesitant short rides, but across the breadth of the land, as though claiming every acre that had once been lost. The dogs, once lean shadows of suspicion, now bounded with loyalty at his side, guarding the farm with a zeal that made him smile. Even the cats, those elusive watchers, had chosen to stay, their lithe bodies stretched on the warm porch in the afternoons, as if declaring the farmhouse theirs as much as his. Word spread beyond the town. At first it was murmurs of disbelief that Jonathan Rowland had restored what all had sworn was dead. Then came curiosity, people riding out to see for themselves. They arrived expecting ruins and found instead a place alive with sound and movement. Some came with wonder in their eyes, marveling at the man who had pulled life from decay. Others came with shame, remembering how they had laughed at him and left in silence, unwilling to admit aloud how wrong they had been. In time, families who could not care for their own animals began bringing them to him. A cow too old to work, a dog left behind by a family moving west, a half-starved goat found wandering near the river. Jonathan took them all in, giving them a place in the new kingdom that had risen from the ashes of the old. The farm was no longer only his redemption. It had become a symbol to those who had lost faith in their own labors, proof that ruin could give way to renewal if only someone refused to abandon it. Men who once mocked him brought lumber as gifts. Women pressed jars of preserves into his hands. Children followed him shyly to the barn to glimpse the piglets or to feed the chickens. Jonathan accepted it all with quiet humility. He had not returned to win their approval, but their newfound respect felt like a healing of wounds he had carried too long. One evening, as he sat on the porch with the last light of the sun bathing the fields in gold, he thought of his parents. He remembered his mother's hands, always busy with work, yet gentle when she rested them on his shoulder. He remembered his father's voice, stern but steady, carrying lessons that had once felt like burdens, but now rang with truth. The journal he had found in the ruined house lay near him, its pages worn from his repeated reading. He opened it and traced the words that had once lifted him in his darkest moments. This farm will only live again when someone chooses it not for wealth, not for ease, but for the life it holds. He closed the book and smiled. He had chosen, and the farm had lived again. The final piece of proof came not in whispers or gestures from neighbors, but in a visit from men who carried authority far beyond the boundaries of his land. The new sheriff rode out one afternoon, an honest man sent from the state to replace the corruption that had once plagued the region. With him came a representative of the Agricultural Board, curious about the reports that a place abandoned for 3 decades had not only been restored, but was flourishing. They walked the grounds with Jonathan, listened to his explanations, inspected the barns, and watched the animals that thrived under his care. When they left, they did so with nods of approval and a promise that the farm would be recognized once more in the county registry, its name restored to honor. Jonathan did not need their recognition to know the truth, but as he watched their figures disappear into the horizon, he felt a quiet sense of completion. The farm was no longer hidden away, no longer a secret struggle known only to him and the animals. It had become part of the world again, seen and respected. As years passed, the ranch only grew stronger. Jonathan added fences, planted orchards, dug irrigation ditches that turned once barren soil into fertile ground. The farmhouse stood tall once more, its windows glowing with the light of evening lamps, no longer hollow sockets staring into the night. The barn echoed with the laughter of visiting children, the sounds of animals healthy and content, and Jonathan himself, though lined with age and hardened by toil, carried himself with the quiet pride of a man who had faced ruin and refused to yield. On one such evening, he sat on the porch once more, Grace grazing peacefully in the pasture, the dogs stretched at his feet, the cats curled on the railing. The air was sweet with the scent of hay and wildflowers, and the sky blazed with the colors of sunset. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of the farm wash over him, the clucking of hens, the snorts of pigs, the rustle of wind in the grass. It was not the silence of ruins that filled him now, but the music of life. He thought of the question that sometimes stirred in him during quiet hours. What would have happened if he had never returned, if he had let the land remain a grave of memories? Perhaps someone else would have come, though he doubted it. Perhaps the animals would have wandered away, or perished, leaving only emptiness behind. But none of that mattered. He had come. He had chosen. And in choosing, he had found not only the life of the farm, but his own. Jonathan Rowland lifted his gaze to the horizon where the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fields that now belonged wholly to him once more. The ruins had given way to resurrection, and in their place stood a farm reborn, a living testament to perseverance, devotion, and the quiet but unyielding power of hope. Don't forget to subscribe right now so you never miss the next incredible story. Click on one of the videos on your screen to keep watching and discover more shocking and unforgettable tales. And if this story moved you, share it with your friends and family. Let them experience it too.